Today, our society leader, Hugh Taft-Morales, will explore the dual histories and the current relevance of May 1st celebrations. His talk is titled The Green and Red Roots of May Day. Hugh.
Good morning. So today I'm going to explore the green and red roots of May Day, the celebration of spring and of workers, the embrace of environmentalism and the labor movement. Now I'm going to suggest at the end today that we combine these red and green roots in order for us to better be able to improve our relationship to the planet Earth and to each other across class boundaries. Let's explore these two roots, though, by starting with the most ancient, which is the green roots. So I'm going to invite you for a moment to close your eyes and imagine, if you will, a lush green forest glen as I begin with a poem entitled Beltane, the Gathering Season by B.S. friend Justy DeForest. Earth turns a fresh face towards the sun as spring's climax is their embrace. Rivers in golden gleam array, valleys don their verdant lace. A sacred celebration sings, buds in pilgrim's procession bloom. Smiles grace each thawing face, forest cathedrals their rites resume. Assemble all, emerge once more, for banished, vanquished is foul weather. Join in Beltane's sweet embrace, for earth and sun have come together. Console old chum, cajole new love, the great wheel turns to light and day. The green man sprawls in sylvan space, the gathering season holds now its sway. Cold subside, friends confide, realms collide, 'tis the month of May. Come dance we in the appointed place, the gathering season is underway. So if you will, continue to imagine the goddess Flora gently emerging from the forest, bringing spring into full blossom by gently emerging from her sleep and gracefully sliding across the fields. Now this is a relatively minor Roman god, one of several fertility goddesses that was honored millenniums ago by a festival in her name, Floralia. All right, so this was first instituted way back in 240 BCE. Floralia lasted 5 days, more or less, bridging the months of April and May. And men and women in revealing costumes that were outlawed the rest of the year would join in festivals that included dramatic productions, mining, circus acts, and it concluded with the hunting of rabbits and goats. That was the culmination of what was known as May Day celebrations. Now in some regions, the goddess of Flora was joined by other goddesses like Maya, my middle child's name, for which the month of May is named. Similar May celebrations occurred throughout pagan Europe, and they took on unique characteristics depending on changes in climate and in culture, but they were all ultimately tied to agricultural life. May Day usually coincided with two factors that made it possible to live off the land: the flowering of the fruit trees and the completion of the lambing, kidding, and calving season. Full flowering trees often predicted a good harvest, which is a good thing. And once the animals, babies, were born, they could all be let out to far pastures. Symbolic fires would burn as a goodbye from their winter stables. And at this point in the year, the various chores eased somewhat to allow for a little time of frivolity. Often the feast was held on May Eve, which was the last day of April. Tables would be decorated with flowers gathered from forest glens, a practice that was called bringing in the May. Often the feast was combined with pre-existing Christian celebrations, because after all, it was good to get the buy-in of ecclesiastic authorities, especially when you want to hold public celebrations that might become let's say, a bit spirited, because copious amounts of mead was served, a sweet alcoholic brew made from honey, or May wine, which was simply white wine mixed with sweet woodruff that flowered during this time of the year. And toasts were raised to thank the bees for their pollinating proficiency, which brought blossoms to the fields and the orchards. In the evening of May Day Eve, bonfires were lit. Young couples would wander off together to celebrate nature in privacy. They delighted in what one scholar called the, quote, amorous possibilities of an unchaperoned night in the woods. And during this time, a mood of permissiveness came in on the spring breeze. And people let their hair down, literally. May Day was particularly important in the Celtic and pagan cultures, which worshipped Earth in a very deep manner, as many original cultures did. They would honor the cycles of the celestial seasons, not just the days of solstice and equinox, which we welcome here at the Ethical Society, but also the days halfway between those 4 days, which were known as cross-quarter days. The one that fell between the fall equinox and the winter solstice, for example, was All Souls' Eve, or Halloween. And the one that fell between the spring equinox and the summer solstice around May 1st was called Beltane. Now, during Beltane, many people spoke about the green man that was in the poem. He would emerge and roam the land according to myth and legend, and his symbol was in all artwork, various forms of green men. They were all usually tied to vegetation cults. Sometimes the face of the green man was portrayed as all being made of leaves, and other times he would disgorge a stream of vegetation which would come out of his mouth before him, and sometimes vegetation would grow from his nose or his ears or even his tear ducts. It was like fertility on steroids. Beltane adopted some of the elements of the Roman festival Floralia, and it added one particular tradition that was popular in Middle Eastern villages of the British Isles, the maypole. The maypole. So to thank Earth for its fertile soil, citizens of every time would go into the woods in a group and cut down the tallest tree they could find, strip it of bark, and decorate it with colorful ribbons and artwork and flowers, and implant it in the earth. Sexual metaphor very much implied. Because in this case, so it seems, they all wanted the tallest maypole because size mattered. Now the Morris dancers would then rise at dawn on the 1st of May to wake up their neighbors with their dancing and singing, bells sewn onto their trousers. With every step, there was a particular popular area in England, the bucolic Cotswolds regions, where the May Day dancers were particularly popular. Then, in the late 19th century, due to the prudish sensibilities of upper-class Victorians, May Day was cleansed of its more bacchanalian characteristics, and one historian said that what was left was nothing more than, quote, a polite, pretty children's pageant. And in fact, children are very much involved in May Day ceremonies when they would hold ribbons that were attached to the top of the maypoles, and they would walk around them in patterned steps, which would create distinctive braided designs on the maypoles. Often the adolescents would be particularly pleased to get tangled up with somebody that they favored as they did these routines. And in the beginning of the 20th century, Morris dancers began coming to the United States. That's when they came here. And they would bring with them their kits. And the kits were simply all of the various accoutrements, including their uniform, which had breeches and armbands and hats, all adorned with bells and ribbons and flowers. And that's what most Americans know about May Day. They dance at our town's hall in Tacoma Park on May 1st. Now, what I found most remarkable when I was researching the Green May Days was that they were so universal. This celebration was everywhere. I focused just here on Roman and Celtic and some Northern European cultures because I didn't have time to talk about all the mentions all over the globe. Even the versions of the Green Man are pretty omnipresent. One historian and musician, Mike Harding, wrote a little book of the Green Man, and he found green men in Lebanon and India and Borneo and maypole, and they're all relatively similar. Their images were carved into churches and temples, and variants of the green man appear in contemporary popular culture today, like the endearing tree man Tom Bombadil, one of the Ents that rescues people in The Lord of the Rings. Now these days, the Green May Day comes out in a variety of ways, and it's still a big deal, especially in a couple of towns. St. Andrews in Scotland. On May Day, students participate in what's called the Dip. The night before, they have a torchlight procession, and then the next morning at dawn, they go swimming in the frigid North Sea, often naked, more power to them. After the pandemic pause, Minneapolis St. Paul happened to be a big place. 50,000 people gather in Powderhorn Park. They have a May Day parade. They have puppets that have these little moving theatrical performances on the main drag in St. Paul, Bloomington Avenue. On May 1st, in almost every city, as I said, you'll see May Day dancers, Morris dancers. And there are a few celebrations that are so international. So changing gears, speaking of the international, I guess, let's explore the red roots of May Day. Now, unlike the grace in the poem Beltane, The Gathering Season, explaining the labor movement May Day involves more brutal descriptions. So I'll ask you to imagine the 4 workers that were clad by authorities in white robes and hoods marching to the gallows on November 11th of 1887. They were sentenced to death on flimsy evidence because of a bomb that exploded in Haymarket Square, killing 7 policemen. As the condemned turned into the alley behind the Cook County Courthouse at 54 West Hubbard Street in Chicago, they were singing the Marseillaise, the ballad to international labor. Now, these lyrics are disturbing. I don't know, people love to hear the Marseillaise in various theater performances, but listen to some of the words which reflect how brutal the struggle can be between labor and the owners. Let's go, children of the fatherland, the day of glory has arrived. Against us tyranny's bloody flag is raised, bloody flag is raised. In the countryside, do you hear the roaring of these fierce soldiers? They come right to our arms to slit the throat of our sons, our friends. This horde of slaves, traitors, plotting kings, what do they want? For whom these vile shackles, these long-prepared irons, these long-prepared irons? Frenchmen, for us, oh, what an insult, what emotions this must excite. It is us that they dare to consider returning to ancient slavery. So, let's back up from the moment that those 4 condemned men were singing this song on the way to the gallows to see what got them there. Clearly, Marx got something right, and that is that industrialization raised pressures on workers. Philadelphia carpenters in 1791 were some of the first U.S. people to demand a strike for a 10-hour day. Back in 1827, another 30 years later, there was another burst of labor activity, and the Carpenters Guild cited words very reminiscent of the Declaration of Independence. They proclaimed, all men must have a right derived from their Creator to have sufficient time in each day for the cultivation of their minds and for self-improvement. Seems reasonable. In 1835, a general strike in Philadelphia and in Boston scared the capitalists to no end. Irish workers right on the coal wards on the Schuylkill, in fact, went on strike and marched for 3 weeks through this city, convincing Philadelphia authorities to bend to their requests for the 10-hour day. Now, soon, the international labor movement really moved into Chicago because the International Working Men's Association was headquartered there. And in 1856, inspired by stonemasons in Australia, this is how international the movement has gotten by that, who were demanding an 8-hour day, these Philadelphia folks and people around the country demanded the same. And discontent with working conditions swelled the Working Men's Association, as well as the Knights of Labor, which was an idealistic union welcoming everybody. And they felt strong enough at that point to set a deadline for the capitalists to accept their demands for an 8-hour day. So on May 1st, 1886, when that deadline was not met, 300,000 to 500,000 workers went on strike in the United States. After 4 days of striking on May 4th, after a day-long rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square, it began to rain and the crowds were pretty much dispersed. A few hundred workers and 100 policemen remained when a bomb was thrown. 7 policemen were killed, 70 were wounded. There was also 4 civilians were killed, as well as 115 wounded. Chaos obviously erupted. Police began actually firing into the crowds, killing other policemen, as the inquiry found out. Labor violence flared out across the country. In Milwaukee, there was a huge strike, and the police fired on the strikers, killing 7, including a schoolboy. And hundreds of Chicago labor activists were rounded up by the police. Now, Peter Limbaugh, who the author of The Incomplete, True, Authentic, and Wonderful History of May Day, described the miscarriage of justice that followed the Haymarket Affair. It was due primarily to fear of the power of an international labor movement. And the bomb was a convenient excuse to look for scapegoats. So according to Limbaugh, even though no evidence was ever produced that any of them had any relationship to this bomb, 4 of them were eventually hanged despite a worldwide campaign in England, Europe, Mexico to save their lives. So this went around the globe. And outrage led the international socialists, who were at that time meeting in Paris, to declare that May 1st, 1890 would be the first official May Day that commemorated those killed at the Haymarket Square, due to the Haymarket Square incident. Labor leaders pledged to continue this demand for 8-hour day, and so every May Day that demand is made. It established an umbrella organization of workers called the Second Internationale. And the very next year, on May 1st, 1890, demonstrations occurred through the United States and more than ever before in other countries. Now, a quarter century later, Red May Day jumped up again when the Bolsheviks took power. May Day was observed in Russia prior to the revolution, but when the Bolsheviks took power, it became the main holiday there. And I grew up seeing these, where you had these pageants of military equipment and red flags and soldiers marching, and all the Kremlin officials would be on the roof of Lenin's mausoleum waving at the crowds. A huge spectacle. Internationally, May Day grew more important and more widespread, and it even involved political power outside of the labor movement. Authoritarian governments began to seize on May Day, perhaps to co-opt the labor movement. So, for example, in 1931, there was political turmoil in Chile, and a right-wing dictatorship took power and declared May 1st a national holiday and mandated that people show up for cookouts and celebrations that then praised the government in the name of the working man. This is very similar to the fact that the Nazi Party in 1933 declared May Day a National Workers' Day in Germany. And even early South African anti-apartheid activists used May Day to protest the government. In May of 1950, in fact, there was a huge rally in Soweto where the government ended up killing 15 of the people at the protests. Back to the US, May Day, red roots of May Day are active today. You can see it in many different forms. In 2006, undocumented Latino workers went on strike as part of what was called the Great American Boycott to protest harsh immigration policies. And on May 1st, 2012, Occupy Wall Street folks used May 1st as a time to protest economic inequality. During the pandemic, workers at some of America's largest corporations, including Walmart, FedEx, Amazon, Whole Foods, went on strike to protest poor health security measures. And so you have this continued element of a symbolic and a practical tool to protest the brutality of capitalism. So, what do these 2 roots of May Day have in common? And one thing that's pretty obvious is both are incredibly international. They occur all over the world. Green and red variations you can be found virtually everywhere. Secondly, both types of May Day, I think this is my most important point of similarity, are resisted by the powers that be. The most powerful people didn't like either green or red roots. Let's go way back to 1240 when the Bishop of Lincoln in England complained of all the frolicking and licentious behavior around the green roots of May Day celebrations. He wrote one letter where he complained that many priests were not just condoning the frivolity and bacchanalian activity, but actually participating in it. That the priests were in with sin, I suppose. In the early 16th century, Henry VIII wanted a monopoly on these sort of parties, and he banned May Day in 1517, which sparked a riot, leading him to pardon 400 but hang 14 just for good measure to make sure that nobody wanted to have too much fun. A century later, the English Civil War brought the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell into power, and May 1st was in their sights. Puritans saw maypole dancing as, quote, a heathenish vanity, generally abused to superstition and wickedness. So maypoles were chopped down in village after village through England. And when May Day traditions tried to take root in colonial New England, Puritan settlers would have none of it. According to historian Limbaugh, some residents of Quincy, Massachusetts, put up a maypole, quote, imbibed copious amounts of beer and danced with indigenous people. Well, this was too much for the powerfully pious of New England. Authorities hired military officer from Britain, Miles Standish, you might know that name, to put an end to it. And in 1627, he and 8 men from the Plymouth colony went to arrest someone, a surprised resident of Mr. Thomas Morton, who had put up a maypole, which, at least in his own mind, was a public service, sort of a festival. By 1644, maypoles were completely banned in New England. This intolerance was evident elsewhere as festivals were quashed by kings and clergy whenever they felt that things were getting too out of hand. Now the red May Days were also repressed by authorities. In medieval England, members of crafts guilds liked to slip into the green roots May Day, but they were definitely around the craft unions. They had lots of fun, and the church condemned such celebrations and drinking and dancing, which would distract the flock from regular prayer and tithing, because after all, their meager earnings could be used for the collection plate or the pub, not both. So in England, the myth of Robin Goodfellow, nicknamed the Lord of Misrule. I like that title. Can I be, instead of leader, can I be the Lord of Misrule? Cause chaos? All right, good. He began encouraging commoners on May 1st to mock the wealthy and ministers. And they did not like that at all. The masses were supposed to behave, pay taxes, and die for Christ in battle. So, in order to escape the honor of such tithing and death, commoners often retreated into the woods in rural areas away from the authorities. So that's a real tie of the red and the green roots. The common people used nature as a way to avoid taxes and conscription. And this fed into an evolving myth of the green man, which appeared in a new form in England as one who steals from the rich and gives to the poor. So the green man became Robin Hood. David Morris, co-founder of the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, wrote, "For centuries, Robin Hood was a symbol of independence, of resistance to the authority of church or state." Well, in 1955, the Catholic Church weighed in to affect messaging around May Day because they were trying to oppose the growing communism in Europe. So Pope Pius XII dedicated May Day to St. Joseph the Worker. Now, Joseph was already the patron saint of craftsmen, so it seemed appropriate. But I bet that Joseph would not have been canonized had he been in a union. So back in the US, when the red roots of May Day began to stir up workers during the Gilded Age, the super rich became very nervous and they lobbied President Grover Cleveland to undercut international labor in 1894 by throwing May Day, May 1st, out the window and establishing the first Monday in September as a celebration, Labor Day. Now, of course, Labor Day was intended to celebrate the good workers, those who behaved and took orders. But after the Russian Revolution, when workers reclaimed May 1st forcefully, American business leaders created even more pressure. In 1821, they declared that May Day would forever be known as Americanization Day. So just try to co-opt that completely. This continued, this narrative, in 1929, Time magazine framed May Day this way. Quote, "To old-fashioned people, May Day means flowers, grass, picnics, children, clean frocks. To up-and-doing socialists and communists means speech-making, parading, bombs, brickbats, conscientious violence." This narrative remained strong in America, began to sort of try to smear the labor movement as being unreasonable, violent. In 1947, as McCarthyism spread more lies and more fear of international labor, the veterans of foreign wars renamed May 1st Loyalty Day, another attempt to co-opt it. And Congress and President Eisenhower made that official in 1958, declaring it, quote, "a special day for the reaffirmation of loyalty to the United States of America and for recognition of the heritage of American freedom." So soon, patriotic parades were competing with labor parades on May 1st. The historian Limbaugh summed up resistance to red shades of May Day this way, saying, "The ruling class did not want to have a very active labor force connected internationally. The principle of national patriotism was used against the principle of working class solidarity." A final related similarity between both versions of May Day is that they grew from the ground up. Certainly, the Green May Day sprung from the fertile, ever-renewing power of nature to bring forth life and sustenance from the earth. And the May Day of the working people grew from the bottom up as well, grassroots of our economy, so to speak, because the earliest hired laborers were, after all, farmers. They were tillers of the soil. They were closest to the earth. Both the green and red roots, because of that bottom-up orientation, had revolutionary potential. And that explains why moneyed interests in the church reacted violently to energy stirred up by both types of May Day, which brings me to the last part of my talk. I want to conclude by exploring how both the green and red roots nurture one revolutionary idea that I believe we should promote every May Day: the Green New Deal, the legislative effort to tie together environmentalism and workers' rights. Now, I admit that concluding this talk with the Green New Deal feels a bit anticlimactic, even for me. And that's due, I think, to while a majority of Americans actually support the Green New Deal, it seems mired in political gridlock. It seems like yesterday's news. Relentless attacks from conservative forces like Fox News that spread inflammatory and inaccurate information about it has stalled its early momentum. And in 2007, when the political commentator Thomas Friedman first put it on the table, it was seen as a moderate thing. The next year, Van Jones made it a household term when his Green Collar Economy book was a bestseller. Environmentalists, labor, and business, Jones argued, can benefit from thoughtful and sustainable development. Jones wrote, "If we're careful, the, quote, approaching green wave will lift all boats." The Green New Deal became the center of the Green Party's last 3 presidential campaigns. It advanced legislatively when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey put forward legislation for it, and they insisted that climate change and unemployment need to be tied together, that it has to help both the green man and the working class. And that's actually a big focus of Power Interfaith focuses on green jobs. Now, Friedman was thrilled with the direction of AOC and Markey's draft, but he thought that it should lean a little bit more towards market solutions, and middle-of-the-road Democrats agreed, fearing that the sort of slant of the Green New Deal would make it politically unpopular and financially unfeasible. So while a majority of the American public and groups like 350.org or the Sierra Club or Friend of the Earth support it, broad-based political support seems impossible to get. Even the AFL-CIO told Ocasio-Cortez that the Green New Deal, quote, was far too short on specific solutions that speak to the jobs of our members and the critical sections of our economy. And while most progressives applauded the Green New Deal's emphasis on environmental justice and helping those most affected and marginalized on the outside of societies, they began to criticize it for not being progressive enough. So it's been attacked by all sides. I think we need to raise the alarm as poor communities of color are increasingly at risk today. We have to send out a Mayday call, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Mayday. It comes from the French M', help me. Mayday, Mayday. But we need to set this, because this is a crisis, both economically and environmentally. Now, I don't turn to the Catholic Church much for inspiration, if you know me, but I'm going to do so today by pointing to Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si'. It offers a broad outline that addresses both human needs and environmentalism. Pope Francis explained, "The major threat I see today lies in the ascent of a purely utilitarian worldview driven by a ruthless economic system that rates everything in terms of its monetary value and sees everything as nothing more than a source of financial profit. Thus, under this mode of thinking, the environment turns into a pool of natural resources to be extracted and turned into profit-generating goods, and people are exploited for their labor and then disposed of when they are no longer of use." So the Pope clearly understands that environmental exploitation and worker abuse are linked. So on future May Days, all year long, in fact, let's draw both from the roots of the Green May Day and the Red May Day. The environment movement and the labor movement need each other, and we need them. And this unity could provide what the Green New Deal advances, which includes economic security, high-quality health care, adequate housing for all, access to clean water and air, healthy, affordable food, high-quality education, upgrading our national infrastructure, and radical cuts in pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. We need a huge coalition to make those possible. So please promote these solutions that support both worker rights and the environment, both the green and red roots of May Day. And then go frolic in nature. It'll do your spirit good. To conclude, I want to call three folks up here to read with me a poem by Langston Hughes from 1938 called Chant for May Day. He weaves the red and green roots together tightly. It's prefaced, by the way, my chorus can come on up. This poem is prefaced by the following. Hughes writes, "To be read by a worker with, for background, rhythmic waves of rising and re-rising mass voices multiplying like the roar of the sea." So, roar, can you come on up here, please? I appreciate folks being willing to be roped into this at a moment's notice, so. We all ready?
Ready.
We all ready? All right. Oh, get closer together. Yeah, I'll speak in here. People will hear me. Yeah, I don't know if they'll hear everybody. The 1st of May, when the flowers break through the earth, when the sap rises in the trees, when the birds come back from the south, workers, be like the flowers. Bloom in the strength of your unknown power. Grow out of the passive earth. Grow strong with union. All hands together to beautify this hour, this spring, and all the springs to come. Forever the workers. Workers, be like the sap rising in the trees, strengthening each branch, no part neglected, reaching all the world. All workers, white workers, black workers, yellow workers, workers in the islands of the sea, life is everywhere for you. When the sap of your own strength rises, life is everywhere. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. When the earth is new, proletarians of the world, arise, grow strong, take power, till the forces of the earth are yours from this hour. Thank you all. Thank you. Stand you for it.